got the microphone.
It's just. That's good. Cool. Hey everybody. My name's Nick. I'm gonna figure out what I'm doing here. My name's Nicholas Garber, senior designer from the New York Times. Welcome to my talk. Yeah, so basically, to kind of give you guys an idea of what I want to talk about today, I want to show you a little bit of my work and some of the stuff I've been doing recently and some of the stuff that's led me to this point. Can you turn it down a little bit? I'm going to get into the mic a little bit closer.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit lower. Thanks. Okay, much better. All right, I'm just going to get into it, otherwise the feedback will continue to go. Okay, cool. So, yeah. Interactive editorials and other digital oddities. So, a brief background. Anyway, I did want to actually set up that video. So the video was inspiration from my childhood. I don't know how many of you have seen that example before. This was like probably 1998 or between 1998 and 2002 or something. There was a studio out of San Francisco that started doing advertising campaigns and brand work for clients using Flash. A lot of us are probably familiar with Flash, but that was my first entrance into kind of interactive web design, and it really kind of kicked off my interest in web design and design in general. And I feel like it's kind of a precursor to, or maybe like a little bit of a foreshadowing of some of my work more recently. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Jumping forward into a little bit later in my career, I did, I've moved around quite a bit, but I did go to the New York Times in around 2016, and just to kind of give you a little bit of context around, interactive editorial, the New York Times was kind of in a digital transformation process. We raised a paywall 2011. Some of you may remember that. And I feel like that's probably the biggest stake in the ground for our digital platforms. And it really led to an investment in, what would be a transition from print as a traditional or legacy media company into the web and all the interesting things that we can do on the web. And it basically paved the way for my team and a lot of the work that we're able to do. Snowfall, you may be familiar with as well. This is an interactive editorial which was released a year later after we raised the paywall, and I think that this probably wouldn't have been done without that sort of like, investment in digital as the way forward. And this has a lot of hallmarks, I think, of what I consider to be, core characteristics of interactive editorials. What you're seeing here is very sort of animated with a lot of 3D rendering and maps and data sort of being presented, and you're kind of led through this experience in a way that kind of brings you into the experience rather than sort of like you pulling everything out of it. A few years later, the advertising and the business side of the company decided to launch a studio called T-Brand Studio. That's the team that I work on. And we basically build brand stories for our clients. And brands will come to us and we tell their story in ways that might reflect the journalism standards of the newsroom, but obviously working on behalf of brands. And this example, Orange is the New, it was for Netflix, for their story, Orange is the New Black. you can kind of see that it's using a lot of sort of like animation, vector animation. There's video embedded within the page. There's also some like data and reporting that sort of reinforces the story. The story is basically about how it's kind of exposing some of the realities of women, the women inmates in prisons, and that was all to like sort of like draw attention also to this show that Netflix had created, one of their first originals, I believe, and it garnered attention, ad age attention from Digiday. So that's kind of like that's kind of the water that I swim in, and it's kind of similar to, or at least a precursor to some of the work that I do now. What is a digital interactive or an interactive, editorial? I feel like the core elements that I'm looking for in an editorial and an interactive are music, soundtrack, potentially maybe ambient audio, depending on the story we're telling. Animation, for sure, whether that's typographic animation, whether that's illustrated animation. Video, obviously, we have a very strong video team, and so there's docu-style video as well that oftentimes will be incorporated into our storytelling. And then illustration, photo, data graphics, and visual pacing, and just like the graphic design of the page is important in order to tell a visually compelling story. So all of those elements really, they really add up to poetry. I like to think of it. Obviously, the story itself has goals, and there's things that we're trying to communicate. But if you really frame it in a way that all of those things kind of contribute to, poetry or something that doesn't quite, it adds up to more than the sum of its parts. That's where the interactive aspect is really interesting. And make sure I'm capturing everything. And I feel like that the desired effect is always like to surprise and delight our readers. Oftentimes, if you're browsing the web and reading, you're going to get what you expect in a lot of cases. And I think what we try to do is really to like bring more than you might expect and really delight our readers. So I also want to deep dive on a project of mine. This project was for HP. They have a campaign called Work Happy. It's kind of essentially around returning to work and whether people are happy returning to work or whether they're angry to return to work. And we did a survey and we asked people what they thought. And I think HP's angle was really we can support office workers or people working from home with our products. And we just want to tell a story about how the transformation from COVID to post-COVID is working and how people feel with their working environments. So for this story, and with a lot of stories, we start with visual exploration. We're looking for concepts. Ideally, to start with, we're looking for concepts that might work to help convey the story that we're telling. You can kind of see here, there's a lot of there's some smiley face in there, which you will see is we did carry through to the final thing. There was this idea of what does it feel like to work happy? What does it look like to feel or to work in a way that makes you unhappy in a situation or an environment that doesn't make you the most comfortable? There's this idea of inflate, deflate that we were exploring. We were also kind of exploring the idea of what does it look like to be, what's the future of work? Can we evoke the idea of working completely digitally by this idea of pixelation? There's a graphic treatment, obviously, but this is just very directional. At this point, we're really not looking for treatment or style. We're really just looking at how does the idea of future of work translate into all these sort of tertiary concepts and themes that we're going to be exploring. We look at artwork, some of it cheeky, some of it a little bit more straightforward or brand friendly. what does it look like to have, future or digital environment or sort of like transcend or like to our physical space. And then we're trying to like play with type treatments and visual exploration, just to kind of get an idea of how all these concepts kind of work together and how they can reinforce each other. In terms of illustration, we'll look at traditional editorial illustration with concepts. This photo illustrator, Matt Chase. Jack Sachs is another digital artist, which has come up more recently, and he does a lot of interesting kind of retro futuristic 3D rendering artwork, which could apply to this. What we ended up landing on was, for the concept happy artwork, was this artist called Taneem Sankari, and he's a generative artist. So I think he does most of his artwork in processing. So he'll take glyphs, characters, sort of model them around a 3D model, which basically gives you, depending on the darkness or the lightness of the glyphs, will sort of give you this 3D effect, and you'll sort of see the animation later in the presentation. Okay, this isn't helpful. I actually had layers underneath, but I'm always like kind of exploring, like, what does that graphic treatment look like? How can I bring the idea of work happy to life? So there's sort of this idea of like, there's some stationery going on in the background. There's some other like, graphical exploration that happens, and this was all sort of an effort to figure out, how do I open the piece? Obviously, we're going to use a certain style of artwork, and you can kind of get an idea of what that looks like. The client will approve that with the board, but there's all this graphic design that needs to happen in order to introduce the story and do it in a way that sort of is thought-provoking and actually captures people's attention. And we sort of landed on this idea of sort of presenting this graph. So the piece is kind of, it's a survey result. So it's kind of like a report of sorts, like a commercial, like a report that a company might put out. So it does have like findings included. So the graphic and the database is also part of this story. So how do we kind of incorporate that to the beginning of the story? Use this cross section, and what you'll see is we kind of have the smiley face, which we found out actually is an interesting side note. We found out the smiley face was originally developed by an illustrator. He was commissioned for an insurance company, I think in Massachusetts or Connecticut or something in the late 50s, as like a morale boosting. So it was kind of interesting to find out that the smiley face that we all know and love was actually devised for morale boosting, which is very similar to this idea of like returning to work. So we definitely adopted it and used it throughout. And what you'll see here is basically there's a lot of elements at play. There's obviously the illustration concept. There's also these ideas of like, where do you land on this axis? Like, are you more or less happy? And with the smiley face sort of flipping around. And then as you move through the piece, there's a lot of like, movement of objects in the foreground or the background. We like to make it feel like you're moving through an experience with dark and light. There's all kinds of opportunities to kind of engage the reader and allow them the opportunity to feel like they're really leading themselves on a journey through this story. So that was my deep dive, and then I have a couple of other examples that I just wanted to show. How am I doing on time? Yeah, I'm getting there. I think I started a little late, so fine. This post was for Dignity Memorial, which you may or may not be aware of, but it's a funeral planning service that you can sort of pre-plan your funeral. This is oftentimes a very stressful event for a lot of family members of a loved one who's died. and it's obviously a sensitive topic. And so, what we're trying to, the story we're trying to tell is how much, easier it is on your loved ones to really take care of that process for them, so that they're not burdened with having to make, what seem like strange decisions in light of the situation that they'll find themselves in. And we really wanted to kind of, reflect these ideas of how sensitive of a time it can be for people, of how important it is to kind of like think ahead for those of you that you love, and sort of make these plans. It's sort of, there's a story being told about a family that did this process, and really how nice it was that their family member really thought of them before they passed away. This is another one, which was for Facebook Watch, which I don't think exists anymore, but they had a show, and they had like a platform at some point where they were like, making content, video content, and there was a show called Limetown, and it sort of explored this story of Russian explorers who had got lost in the Siberian wilderness, and there's sort of mystery. No one knew what had happened to them, but there were sort of like myths or like ideas about what had happened, and there were also like, some theories as well. And so this one is sort of exploring the ideas or the theories around how they disappeared. And what's interesting about this one is that at the bottom of the first sort of page, you get the option to choose your own adventure. So you just go right and choose one, which is like science fiction, a take on the possibility of how these people, their demise. And then the other one is more of a maybe a scientific take as well. And so there's a lot of like interesting photography being used here. Some of it was like found from the people who were lost. They like recovered some of their cameras and things. So very interesting. And then we sort of also commissioned an artist to kind of replicate some of the scenes that, whether it was pertaining to the science fiction version or the scientific theory. And then one more for Verizon. This one was for Verizon during their 5G sort of launch. There was a lot of marketing around 5G happening at the time. I'm sure you remember the onslaught of 5G theories and what it could do for your life. But in this case, it's actually interesting because they did sponsor some of the work of the New York Times and the R&D lab at the New York Times. The New York Times does have an R&D lab. We do develop technology for journalists in the field, particular photojournalists. And in this case, this is an interesting bit of the story, but we did develop a sort of a backpack which allows photographers in the field to be able to connect their DSLR, whether it's to put the SD card in the transmitter or not. I think it depends on the version, but like basically you can just transmit your photos directly from the field to the newsroom, and they're basically thumbnails at that point, so that the newsroom can kind of like look at everything and see what they want to choose and to upload for the quickest result. So very interesting, and it's kind of developed over time, and Verizon wanted to kind of like highlight this and also support it with money. Money's always good. And so we're sort of like telling the story of how that story about the Times and developing that technology supported by Verizon, and what 5G enables you to do. I guess the implication is like 5G enables you to do amazing things, potentially. And I'm going to start to flip a little bit more quickly through some of these. This one was for Audi, about automotive like preventative safety sensors. So we're obviously using illustration here in this case, but also animating it to nice effect. Interactivity is not always complete. completely immersive. Sometimes it's subtle. This was Mitchell Eaton did some illustration of food, and this is 3D illustration. I really do not recommend 3D illustrating food. It's like such an organic material that it makes it almost impossible to find the models for and do it effectively. But we haven't pulled this one off. This one was for DoorDash during the pandemic. We were looking at DoorDash really wanted to highlight some of the neighborhoods throughout New York City and kind of celebrate the food cultures of different neighborhoods throughout New York, and especially because during the pandemic no one was going to restaurants. They really wanted to, highlight the fact that you could order your food, have it delivered to you. And so we kind of like highlighted 3 or 4 out of 5 restaurants and did illustrations of their food, and kind of the scene up at the top of the article also sort of like this sort of aerial view of New York and like all of the different complexity and interesting detail that you find in an aerial view of New York. And then we kind of used as a rough concept the idea of like mimicking a restaurant menu in vivid color. So this was a love letter to Manhattan. And then one more for National Geographic. We did a story for the show. They have a National Geographic channel, a show called Limitless, and it's all about like removing the limits of what you perceive to be your human, your physical limits. It's kind of like, so we're kind of exploring what it looks like to go beyond your physical limitations. And there's all kinds of, there's way too much stuff in here, but Chanel, this one is interesting. They brought this 55.55 carat diamond necklace to New York to put on display at the new Chanel flagship store on Fifth Avenue. And we did this sort of like exploration of how it was made, what it was inspired by, lots of interesting details. Interesting that the Place Vendôme in Paris is actually like the shape of the bottle topper for the Chanel No. 5 perfume, which is interesting. It's also like the shape helped inspire the central, the biggest diamond piece in that necklace. I don't know how much this thing is worth. It's probably like millions. And I think I'm out of time. So yeah.
Awesome.
Who is next? Thank you guys. Thank you guys.
Feel free to do so.
Sure, yeah. Let's just do a quick one. Sure.
Yeah. What kind of tools do you what do you use for your animations?
Okay. Repeat the question for the recording.
Yep. Okay. What kind of tool do I use for animation? It depends whether you're speaking about page animation or whether it's animation that exists in artwork. An artist for illustration will usually take care of animation on their side, and whether they do that with After Effects or 3D, other 3D tools, it's up to them. But for page animation in web design, we will use CSS, and we have tools. We have tools for building on the web. But I don't know if I should say this, but we use Webflow. It's a great tool.
EvolveDrupal's on Webflow.
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, use CSS.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.